So, as in previous weeks, and as I said, I'm going to continually open these meetings with a disclaimer or, the reason for this, or not the reason, but you get the idea. How you should use this information you're getting. And I like to open with a quote. This one's from Ravi Zacharias again, and he says, "A conviction not undergirded by love makes the possessor of that conviction obnoxious, and the dogma that one possesses becomes repulsive." I'll read that again. "A conviction not undergirded by love makes the possessor of that conviction obnoxious, and the dogma that one possesses is repulsive." So again, as I've always said at the beginning of these meetings, any way you want to use this information, always use it in love. Love is the most important thing to all of this stuff we're discussing. So if you remember last week, we talked about the moral argument. I'll go over it again. The premise one says, if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Objective moral values and duties do exist, therefore God exists. It's a very simple argument. Mostly what we talked about last week was premise one and naturalism, which is a form of atheism that professes that all that exists is the natural world, and that humanity, the universe, all matter is just a product of time, chance, and evolution. And that the naturalist agrees with premise one. They would agree that, yes, there is no God, and therefore there is no objective moral values, no moral duties. So we're going to stick with naturalism for now, and we're going to talk about premise two. The naturalist disagrees with premise two. They don't agree with this argument because they say premise two is false. There are no objective moral values and duties because we are just products of evolution. So what does this lead to? This leads to something you've heard before called moral relativism. I mean, relativism is a word that's thrown around a lot, especially if the word itself isn't thrown around, it's very prevalent in sort of popular culture. Around the turn of the century, this movement called postmodernism sort of came into popularity in the beginning of the 1900s, and really in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, it really was very prominent. Postmodernism is very sort of hard to define, and postmodernists sort of want it that way. It's basically, there is no truth, there is no meaning. You sort of make meaning for yourself. In art, it sort of began in art, and if you were to read like sort of a book or a poem, the intent of the author and the content actually is irrelevant. It's what it means to you that actually is the true meaning of it. So through this and through philosophy, we have what is called moral relativism. Moral relativism could have any number of definitions. It's sort of, what is true for you isn't true for me. Truth becomes relative. Morals become relative. What is good for me, may not be good for you, but that doesn't matter. What I think is right may be different than what you think is right, but it doesn't matter. It's also culturally relative, like what one culture defined their moral law as, like another culture may not. And I brought up sort of Nazi Germany, and that their morality, their ethical values really are no more right or wrong than ours. It's just culturally relative. So again, like the objective morality is sort of replaced by what the individual thinks. You might not like something I do, but it doesn't matter because I want to do it. So it doesn't matter what you think about it. Moral relativism rejects any claims of objective moral truth, objective moral law, absolute objectives, and any objective moral duty. No one actually has an objective moral duty to ever do any moral actions. If this belief is true, as a naturalist would agree, is that all choices and beliefs on morality are equal. There is no good, bad choice in any situation. It's all about preference, and our preferences have sort of evolved in us. They would compare it to, it's like, oh, you might like chocolate, you might like vanilla. No one's either right or wrong, and morality is the same way under moral relativism. Basically, the words good, bad, right, wrong, evil are actually meaningless. They think they don't have any meaning. So that's moral relativism, and if you take premise 1 to be true and premise 2 to be false, that is what we have. Now, there's a lot of problems with moral relativism that you might be anticipating. And mostly what you hear about it in culture is a lot of it is just like lip service. It's lip service to moral relativism. And I actually think that moral relativism is actually unlivable. I think it's basically, I think they say right and wrong are actually meaningless. I think moral relativism is meaningless. A lot of people give lip service to it. They'll just say, like, if you hear about what one culture is doing or what one person does, and you're just like, oh, well, I don't really like that they do it, but they're just making the choice. We should give them the freedom to make that choice. You'll hear a lot about words like tolerance, acceptance, freedom. You shouldn't think your idea is any better than somebody else's idea. However, these words have moral implications to them. Tolerance is just a different type of objective morality. Being tolerant of someone else's ideas is, again, just using some type of moral law. Freedom is the same thing. So again, when I say moral relativism, I think is unlivable, it's because you're just replacing one moral law for another one. And like I said, people like to give lip service to it. But when you get down to it and talk to most people, they're going to sort of reveal some type of moral inkling. They're going to think one thing is right and one thing is wrong. So there are logical ways that relativism can be pretty easily refuted, but it's sort of easier to understand when we use truth instead of morality, and then I'll bring it back to morality. So you hear statements like all truth is relative. And in purposes of the argument, I talked about objective, subjective. Relative and subjective mean the same thing. So we have this statement, all truth is relative. Now, the problem with this statement is that if this statement is true, then is it relatively true? And if it's relatively true, then there are instances where the statement is false. Self-defeating, self-contradictory. We can write the same statement a different way. Another one you might have heard. There is no absolute truth. Now, yes, you already know. The problem with this statement is if this statement is to be taken as an absolute statement, then it is self-refuting. However, if this statement is not absolutely true, then there are instances when this statement is false. And if there are instances when this statement is false, then it is always false. Because if there's an instance of an absolute truth, then that truth is always true. So again, going to these things become sort of fun to talk about. But again, you'll hear a lot of lip service. Say like, well, what's true for you may not be true for me. Well, let's just take that statement and use that. If I say what is true for me is that relativism is false, then is it true that relativism is false? Because you say, oh, what's true for me is true for me. It's just not true for you. Well, I'm saying what's true for me is relativism is false. So again, it's a self-defeating view. Like I said, you hear it a lot in popular culture, this lip service. However, in the academic world right now, in the world of philosophy, most philosophers are not relativists because, like I said, it is very self-defeating. Again, now, these are truth claims, but we can use the same logic when we bring in morality. Well, what's right for you may not be right for me. But in a one-on-one situation, what if what you think is right is to murder me. But then what I think is right is for you not to murder me. We can't both be right. We can't both be morally right in that situation. So again, you can use multiple types of violations like this, you know. Is it right for like a woman to be raped if the rapist thinks it's right? I mean, you know, the woman probably doesn't think it's right. So if you take moral relativism, they can't both be right. And again, so it becomes very self-defeating. If we take it to the broader terms of culture, when we say like morality is culturally relative, it's not so much personal, but it's like we have our senses of morality because of the culture we were raised in. However, the problem with this is what's called the reformer's dilemma. Now, if a culture comes up with a type of morality that is true for that culture, then why are there reformers? How come that culture gets reformed? Think of Martin Luther King Jr. when, you know, he rose to sort of fight segregation. But at the time, segregation was considered sort of culturally okay. So then if culture determines morality, like Martin Luther King Jr., and many people consider him this, would be an immoral person for fighting against that. Same could be said of like Gandhi and Christ. It's like, how can they actually change society if morality is just relative to that culture? If that culture determines their morality by what that culture says, why would they ever be able to change it? So again, relativism in that sense is very self-defeating. Most of the people I quoted for you last week, these hardcore naturalists, a lot of these guys some of them have passed away. There's very few of them left. And even people like Richard Dawkins, who I quoted, who wrote The God Delusion. Let me find his quote. I'll read it again because we're going to be talking about it a lot. Where he said, "There is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pointless indifference. We are machines for propagating DNA. It is every living object's sole reason for being." Now again, Dawkins gives a lot of lip service. However, one of Dawkins' main goal is to fight the evil of religion. He thinks that the ills of the world are caused by religion. So again, he just quoted that there is no good, there is no evil. So why does he write these books? Why does he fight against religion? That's what I mean. It sort of becomes an impossible way to live. It leads to moral chaos. Excuse me. So is there any questions about moral relativism as I've explained it? Is it understood? So again, we'll talk about, they say morality is an illusion. It's not real. That the word good is meaningless. Not only that duties are meaningless, that the word ought, like you ought to do something, that ought has no meaning. They'll say things like, you can't observe goodness, like goodness can't be measured, like so then it doesn't exist. When you say, given a situation, if you see a child being abused, like you sort of have a duty to stop it, you ought to stop it. People who sort of believe that morality is an illusion would say that ought is actually a meaningless word. Like there is no meaning there. And they would bring up things like say, I might have a feeling that I need to stop it, but there's no ought behind that feeling. So in that sense, like they tend to bring up examples of, I actually brought up the chocolate and the vanilla. They would say that, oh, well, it's just like a feeling. I prefer for that child not to be abused. So then I would stop it. Which again, to me, just seems sort of more like lip service. So again, talking about premise 2, that's their objection to it. But then how do we know that premise 2 is true? This is a tough one because there isn't really good arguments for it. However, it just becomes what is called like very basic. Like you have a very basic understanding that we might theorize about all these morals, try to come up with a moral system, but when you get down to the individual level, when someone sort of wrongs me or wrongs you, someone were to break into your house and attack you, you have a very real sense of the wrongness of it. When you do something like loving, when you have if you have children or parents, and when you do something that's like loving, you have this sense of the goodness of it. You have the sense of this goodness of compassion. What this is called a basic belief. The basic beliefs don't really need to be justified. And so our moral sense, I think, is so innate, it's very much like our physical senses. You know, like we don't really have to question the fact that I have a head, because I can touch my head. Morality comes to us in this very similar way. And like once you sort of experience a moral dilemma or a moral decision or a wrongness, something like I just said, someone attacks you, you know, if I went up to Tommy and just punched him in the face, he would have this sense that not only did it hurt, but that he would feel wronged. So I think that just premise 2 is, and many philosophers argue this, that it's very rational on its own. And like I said, do you have a question, Tommy?
Yes, kind of. C.S. Lewis, I'm going to borrow from him real quick. He made a point, I think, that pertains to this, and you can tell me if I'm wrong or not. He said that like if somebody was in like a back alley and they were like being stabbed or like really attacked, and you were walking by, that like the naturalist would argue that like you shouldn't, like your fight or flight instinct as an animal or just a being would be to run because you would want to flee from danger, yet you ought morally to go and help that person and try to help them survive. Would that be kind of similar to the fact that objective moral values and duties do exist, in the sense that like you should run from danger, yet morally you want to help somebody and you enter into danger?
Yes.
That would.
I mean, that is sort of like that innate sense, that just feeling. And the thing is that you might come into that situation and not help them. You might choose and rationalize to run, but you still experience that morality. You still experience that feeling. Like you might feel guilt later, but you still have to make a moral like there's a moral question that is you're faced with. Now, the naturalists, as I said, they would say that our morality is something that has evolved in us to help the propagation of our genes, to help the evolutionary process. It's about survival. So that even when moral decisions don't seem like they're helping our individual survival, they're there to help the culture, the humanity as a whole. And so they say that we've come to recognize morality just through evolution. It's just an evolutionary process. Now, there's a way to respond to this that has nothing to do with relativism and what I've talked about, is that I'll even give evolution. I'll give the whole process of evolution. And that even if evolution is true, though, like it doesn't show that our moral sense isn't objective. We may have come to know morality because of evolution. As we've advanced as a species, we've entered into this moral realm, but it doesn't prove that that was the creation of the moral realm. This is sort of what's called the genetic fallacy, is that the process by which you come to know something doesn't make that thing true or false. You could think that like a fortune teller may be able to predict the stock market, and just because it's like she rolled some dice and then like she made some claim that turned out to be true, it doesn't affect the truth of the claim she made just because of how she came to know it. You know, so the process by which one tries to like invalidate something by explaining how it came about doesn't really say anything about the truth of that thing. So even if someone can like point to the basis of biological understanding of morality, it doesn't really say anything about the truth of morality or the truth claims of morality. They would have to further come up with evidence or a cause to show that evolution actually causes morality, not that just helps us understand morality. So again, talking about premise 2, again, it's just a lot of illustrations to help you understand premise 2. You can think back, I'll even use some Christian examples. I mean, think about the wrongness of the Crusades. Think about going and trying to take over lands by the sword and force people to become Christians. There's just something that feels wrong. There's just an innateness to it. The sex scandal with the priests. I mean, just the violation of the boys by these people in power. There's just something that is innately feels wrong about someone in power taking advantage, especially sexually, of a young child. There was the Inquisition that killed people for heresy. There was even a move, I don't know if you've heard of the Anabaptists in the Dark Ages, this movement of these Christians who thought that child baptism was wrong and that people should choose to get baptized, and they were rebaptizing themselves. And the church actually went and tried these people and tortured and killed them for heresy. So again, it's hard to get away from tolerance and compassion, love, kindness, and then intolerance. That doesn't just feel like it's something that a culture teaches you. And again, like I said, how we come to know morality doesn't refute or prove the truth of it. Said just because you were maybe aggressively taught to be a certain way doesn't really affect the truth of what you were actually taught. I hope that makes sense. To not muddy the waters too much, I'm going to throw some philosophical words at you. What we're talking about is the ontology of morality. And ontology is the nature of what something is, nature of existence. It's does morality exist is an ontological question. Then how we get to know morality is what's called epistemology. It's how you become to know something is a different thing than what something actually is. So you might hear those words thrown around if you ever decide to read any of this on your own. Now, Christians and theists aren't the only one who agree with this. There are many atheists who agree with the truth of premise 2. Walter Sinnott Armstrong, who is an atheist philosopher, said, "The most common way to choose among moral theories is to test how well they cohere with our own intuitions or our own considered judgments about what is morally right and wrong, about the nature ideal of a person, and about the purpose of morality." Lewis Vaughn, a humanist, also an atheist, in his book The Case for Humanism wrote, "If any moral theory approves of obviously immoral acts, the theory itself is flawed and must be discarded. If our moral theory sanctions the inflicting of undeserved and unnecessary suffering on, say, an innocent child, we must conclude that something is very wrong with that theory. Most moral philosophers have rejected views that moral statements only express emotions of approval or disapproval, or that moral judgments are not objective but relative, entirely dependent on what a person or society happen to believe. These philosophers reject these views precisely because they cannot explain our everyday, ordinary moral experience." So, again, like I said, it's hard to argue for premise 2 because it's something that just seems so innate. Again, in philosophy, they call these basic beliefs, things that just seem so innate in our everyday experience that we don't really need arguments for them. Now, I want to go back to the naturalist objection of premise 2, back to that evolutionary objection. That human beings, as I said, our entire universe are just the product of chance, matter, no cause, no design. That moral objectivity that we experience is just an illusion. Back to what Dawkins said. There's a problem with this that they don't consider, is that if morality is just to serve evolution, what's to say that our minds and our brains don't just serve that same process? So that the very reasoning we use to object to this moral argument is only just to serve evolution. It has no value in truth. In fact, John Gray, an atheist philosopher, said this. He said, the human mind serves evolutionary success, not truth. Truth is irrelevant. Our minds are actually, they would claim, are being controlled by our genes and are not geared towards truth, but survival and propagation. The species must survive. Truth does not matter. So the very science and biology that they espouse has nothing to do with the truth of it. It just has to do with how it serves the evolutionary process. John Lennox, Christian philosopher, in response to that very quote by John Gray, said, so what about Gray's own mind? One must suppose, according to Gray, that his writing of that sentence, that the human mind serves evolutionary success, not truth, that his writing of that sentence only serves evolutionary success. But then Gray himself has undermined the very concept of truth, and thus has removed all reason to take him seriously and any truth claims his statement might have. So in their own reasonable objections to these arguments, they undermine their own objections. That if everything is just to serve the DNA, the selfish gene, that nothing that they study, nothing that they discover, nothing that their even physical senses observe that they think are true could actually be true. It's all just to serve evolution. So they sort of shoot themselves in the foot with that very objection. So I think we're done with the naturalists for now. It might make Tommy happy. And as I said, the naturalists are the only ones who really disagree with premise 2. I said that in popular culture, it's very prevalent to disagree with premise 2. But like I said, as in the world of the academics and philosophy, it's not. They realize that it's becoming unlivable to not believe in objective morals or not live by objective morals. So, question? Yes.
So, Ben, if these philosophers believe that morality is improving, evolving, how do they justify what just took place in the last century, where evil, whether it be Hitler, Stalin, Mao Zedong, far outweighs even what appears to have taken place prior to that century? Wouldn't their argument be that man is constantly morally improving and getting better? How do they justify that?
I mean, they wouldn't say that man's morality is getting better. They would just say that morality itself is an illusion and it just serves evolution. That they wouldn't see, they would claim that there was nothing wrong with those things that we observed. The 20th century, which has actually been the bloodiest century in human history, that like there isn't actually anything wrong with anything that happened because wrong is an illusion. Does that sort of answer your question?
But aren't there some philosophers who feel that morality?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what I'm going to get to. I'm talking about, these hardcore atheistic naturalists who think that it's just nature. As Darwin said, red of tooth and claw. Like it's just survival of the fittest. That they would say morality is meaningless. But like I said, I quoted two guys who agree with premise 2, but they reject premise 1. They think that premise 1 is wrong. So they would say that God is not the basis for objective morality, that there's other things that are the basis for objective morality. So one of these views is called moral realism. I mentioned this last week, and I don't know if you think back to our earlier classes, if you were here, I talked about mathematical realism, and that there's mathematicians who think that certain mathematical objects are actually real. They really exist. Like the number 2 is a real thing, not just like you have 2 objects and it's a descriptor, that the number 2 is a real thing. Perfect circle might be a real thing.
Derek Jeter was number
Oh, that was a joke. Derek Jeter was number 2. He was a real guy. So, so like that view, moral realists feel the same way about morals. They think that these moral values are actually real existing things. That there is this thing called goodness that exists. There's justice and it exists. Love is a thing that exists. And this goes all the way back to ancient Greece with Plato. This was Plato's view. And it's,
When you put on the board last week,
yeah.
is it good because God said it was good, or is
Well, that comes from this discussion.
Oh.
I'll get back to that. But so we call it moral realism now, but in the past it could be called moral Platonism. So again, that Plato thought that there were like these good values and bad values, and they just existed. Now, if you think about that, you're already starting to see the problems. Like, where does justice exist? You know, I mean, it doesn't have to exist in a place because it's not physical, but does justice exist?
Superman? Justice.
So part of this view, and again, this view isn't actually very popular right now, but I just wanted to go over it. It sort of is unintelligible to think of goodness existing. The same reason I said I don't think mathematical realism is a real thing. I don't see where, like, how the number 2 actually exists, and I don't see how these moral values just exist, you know. Freedom as a value, just freedom exists on its own. But the other problem with this is, look in the argument, I talk about values and duties. If justice and goodness exists, compassion exists, yes, the value might exist, but then how do those things then compel us to do them? Like, how does the value of goodness then instill in us the duty to be good? Where do we get our moral obligations from? From these values that exist that they don't have a will, they're not intelligent, they're just these sort of weird values. Another problem for this view is that why then did the evolutionary process, which is supposed to be total chance, evolve these beings that then align themselves with these arbitrary existing values? I mean, the process of evolution is so, the fact that life even exists, is the chance of it happening is so low, and then to add on top of it that we then evolve to align ourselves with these moral duties that just exist in this abstract realm makes it even harder for that process to take place. And also, as I said, duties, if you think that love exists, then wouldn't hate also exist? And then why are we compelled to do one over the other? So again, I'm not going to stay on moral realism wrong, but it is a view. Sometimes it's like certain philosophers will just fall back on it as a defense. But yeah, this was what Plato sort of believed, that there was goodness, and that, you know, in his view, there were like the gods, Zeus and stuff, and then that they could choose then to follow the goodness. And then it was actually, as Christianity started to move throughout the world, that's when they sort of had these original discussions, and they would develop these arguments, and they would say, like, no, there isn't goodness, there's actually this God who is good. And these debates would happen. And so that type of discussion has been going on for a very long time. St. Augustine addressed this issue very clearly, talks about it a lot in his writing. Okay, so let's move on to what Tommy really wants to talk about, humanism. So again, humanists believe in premise 2. They take that to be true. But again, they say premise 1 is the false one. That moral values don't need God for their foundation. Walter Sinnott Armstrong, who I've quoted a bunch, in a debate at Dartmouth College, when he was asked, why is it wrong to harm another human being? Like Bertrand Russell, he just said, it just is objectively wrong. It's like, don't you agree with me? I don't know who he was debating, but the person he was debating was yes, of course I agree with you. But he said the question is, why is it wrong? What's the foundation for it to be wrong? So again, humanists, there are many different kinds, there are many different types. Christianity often gets criticized because there are so many different types of Christianity. Well, you can sort of respond back, there are so many different types of humanists. You were familiar with the saying, man is the measure of all things. That's a humanist view. The problem with humanism is that it really struggles with the arbitrariness of it. When you ask humanists for the foundation of their morality, you'll get things like, well, human well-being, or human life, or, utilitarianism, which is, the maximum good for the maximum number of people. What benefits people is the basis for morality. The problem is that they still skip the question. Why is human well-being good? Like, why objectively is it good for humans to flourish? There's been a new term sort of used for these people that are sort of becoming called religious atheists or spiritual atheists. A lot of them borrow from Buddhism. And I'm not going to get too deep into Buddhism because we're going to actually, in the next coming weeks, get into other religions a little more. But Buddhism at its core is atheistic. However, it's not aggressively atheistic. Buddhism says you can believe in God, it just doesn't matter. Yeah, that's not the point. So a lot of philosophers are sort of borrowing from Buddhism. I didn't have enough time to finish my notes. I'm going to be reading from my phone. I apologize. Yeah. So a criticism of a lot of these atheists is that they sort of borrow from the last 2,000 years of the rise of Christianity and religion. They like to use Christian morality, but get rid of the Christian God. That's why they move towards Buddhism. Or they say that you can be spiritual without God. Like, spirituality still exists, but there is nothing greater than man. So they acknowledge the existence of unphysical things, of unnatural things, but they still don't accept God. One of the prominent people in this field is Sam Harris. I like Sam Harris. You might have seen him on a news talk show. He's around a lot. He's very vociferous against the rise of radical Islam. He really fights against it. So again, you sort of watch him and you're like, yeah, but he doesn't feel any better about Christians. He thinks that the Christian view is just as erroneous. He just thinks we've kind of gone through a reformation, so he doesn't have to worry about us. But he thinks we're equally wrong.
Radical Christians or just Christians?
He thinks that any belief in God in general is just wrong. But he thinks that Christianity isn't as dangerous as Islam right now. In 2010, he published a book called The Moral Landscape: How Science Can Determine Human Values. And like I said, in this book, he says you don't need God for a basis to ground your objective moral truth. He wrote, "We simply must stand somewhere. I'm arguing that in the moral sphere, it is safe to begin with the premise that it is good to avoid behaving in such a way as to produce the worst possible misery for everyone." So what he goes on through this book, I've read the book, is that he starts bringing, what's the opposite of misery? It's human well-being. So he thinks that we can use human well-being as the basis for objective morality. What benefits human well-being is objectively morally good. So It says also in advances in science, we might be able to like use neuroscience, and we can actually examine the brain so we can see the result actions on the brain, and you can see if it has a negative impact or a positive impact. And that this also then science will then reveal to us what is good. Again, there's a problem with this though, because he still skipped over the question. He's been arbitrary about it. Going back to what I wrote before on, as Dave brought up, Euthyphro's dilemma. The question is, we'll write it down again, is something good because God wills it? Or does God will it because it is good? The problem with humanism is it is in the first one. Humanists say that human well-being is what determines goodness, but it's arbitrary. That's just one man saying what he thinks is good. But if I, as a human, am equal to him, why can't I say there's something else is the basis for good? Man, like I said, man being the measure of all things. And the other problem is they reject premise one, and they say they don't agree with the naturalists. They don't agree in moral relativism or moral chaos. However, they have the same exact starting point. Most of these humanists think that life came from nothing. It just evolved. So again, what gives morality any sort of authority under that view? And again, the other problem with this is when you say human well-being is the basis, like, yes, that's human well-being is objectively good. The question why isn't a faulty question. You have the right to ask, why is human well-being objectively good? You know, you can imagine a science fiction scenario where, let's just say there's a race of aliens that come from Andromeda, and they say, you know what's going to be good for us is we're going to actually use the human race as food. We're going to just feed on you. Where does human well-being enter into that scenario? If it's because, oh, we are the highest intelligence on this planet, well, what if another higher intelligence comes in and says, no, we're going to use you this way? Where does Sam Harris's argument stand then in that circumstance? In fact, there was one of the atheists I quoted before, I can't remember who he is, but he wrote a paper, he was a naturalist, he wrote a paper entitled, Is Rape Wrong on Andromeda? And he imagines, like, through evolution of a totally different species, they might have a totally different moral view than we do. So again, I side more with the naturalists than I do with the humanists. I mean, the humanism, their morality is much more in line with me, but their basis, they have no foundation for morality. That saying to, oh, Hitler was wrong because it was bad, it interfered with human well-being. I'm like, yeah, but Hitler didn't think so. Hitler thought that, you know, these people he was eradicating were actually bad for humanity. They're bad for the Third Reich. So, Tommy, any questions about humanism?
Yes.
So let me play devil's advocate and just let's propose that human achievement, or like the greatness of like human thought and like the pinnacle of what humans could achieve. Let's just say that was the basis for human moral values, and that all what we could potentially discover is itself a moral value. Like that's like very like Ayn Randian. Like she's like, you can't, like, anything that would hinder us achieving some type of human greatness is technically immoral. Like Hitler would be immoral because he's delaying our ability to achieve what we can achieve. And I think of like that movie, the movie with Matthew McConaughey recently when he goes into outer space. Like that's human like achievement is itself like I guess you could say it's almost like its own morality.
Okay, I'll answer that question.
Okay.
So we live on a planet of limited resources. If we were to wipe out 30% of the population, it might actually help human achievement. It might actually allow the world to last longer and allow our sciences even more time to grow. So based on that argument, why don't we just wipe off 30% of the population off the planet? It would be less struggle for food. More food would be readily available.
That's a pretty good argument, actually.
And get rid of the weaker ones.
Yeah. I mean, if human advancement is, like Ayn Rand says, is human achievement is great, then what about all these people who aren't contributing to human achievement? I think Hitler would argue that. Like, that would be the response. Hitler would say these people are actually hindering the human achievement.
Well, she might say that actually would be okay.
Well, yes. I mean, Ayn Rand,
She was totally okay with people getting out of the way if they're in the way.
yeah, she wasn't a humanist in the terms of today's humanists. I mean, she was she basically was very similar to Hitler, and she used Nietzsche's view of the Superman, that whatever heights man could strive to, those were right, the right to power. Like if one group of humanity rises above the rest, and then they can get rid of that group because they're weaker, she thinks that would be ultimately good. Yeah. Any more questions sort of about anything we discussed?
Her OCD's kicking in. Is something good because God?
Oh,
gave it the
yeah,
other
sorry.
person?
I can just erase it. I'll just erase it.
Oh. I was going with it.
Okay, so again, the presentation of these arguments is that I'm not saying, like, you often get asked, well, prove to me that like God exists. And in the beginning I talked about proofs, is that the only time you actually have like proof like they want is in mathematics. It's impossible to 100% prove something. But what I'm and I think this argument shows, is that belief in a God sort of gives you a coherence in your worldview. So like when they ask me, like, well, why is it wrong to kill, or why is it wrong to rape? I'll say, because God has said it is wrong. It gives you coherence. It gives you like an understanding. I'm going to sort of close with a couple more quotes. Hobart Maurer, who was a professor at Yale and professor at Harvard of psychology, was sort of a big part of like some of the psychological revolution of the 60s and 70s. Excuse me. He said, "We psychologists have looked upon the whole matter of sin and moral accountability as a great incubus, and have claimed our liberation from it as epoch-making. But we have discovered that to be free, to have the excuse of being sick rather than being sinful, is to court the danger of also becoming lost. In becoming amoral, ethically neutral, and free, we have cut the very roots of our being, lost our deepest sense of identity, and with neurotics themselves find ourselves asking, who am I? What is my deepest destiny? What does living really mean?" He was an atheist. I'm going to get into these gaps, there's 4 gaps of atheism. This is one of them. How do you get morality from amorality? How did we get that jump? Where in the evolutionary process did that happen? And if it all has just happened by chance, what gives it any ultimate meaning? And again, you can deny that morals don't mean anything, but I argue that you're not going to be able to live a life that way. People that tried, Friedrich Nietzsche, who declared God is dead, went insane because he couldn't live this life. He spent the last 20 years of his life in a mental institution because he struggled with his moral sense. You may have heard the story of the horse of Turin. Close to the end of his life, he loved Italy. He was in Italy, and he saw a horse and a buggy, and the owner of the horse was beating the horse. And Nietzsche, who denied morality exists, threw himself in front of this man and tried to save the horse. And then he went home and struggled, like, why did I do that? Like it's impossible to get away from morality. And we have a very simple answer in Christianity. Romans 2 says that the moral law is written on all men, so that even the people who don't believe this still act accordingly. Again, so Christianity also gives a very simple moral system. You know, we don't need to have these advanced, you don't need utilitarianism, you don't need pragmatism, you don't need humanism, you don't need neuroscience. Christ broke it down to love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. We love God because God is sacred, God is holy, God created us. But he created us in his image, so therefore I am also sacred. You are also sacred. Love yourself, love your neighbor. The humanist acknowledges that there's something special about a human being. Human beings are moral agents. And in Christianity, we find that answer, in that humanity is sacred. Something sacred about the human, because we are created in the image of the sacred. So that's all. Question?
I do have a question, but maybe I should ask you privately.
Oh, you can. Some people might want to hear.
Okay. All right. All right. So you said that naturalists believe that morality is an illusion
Yes.
and that we exist just to reproduce the DNA type
Correct.
of thing. But this is their philosophy actually undermines their own this thought undermines their own philosophy.
Yeah, as
But
I said.
I didn't quite get how. If you could explain that again.
Okay, so as I explained, is that to the naturalists like Richard Dawkins, the only purpose of being and living is to promote our genes, to propagate the species. And that, I'll go back to his quote. I'll read it again. Sorry for all the notes. There is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pointless indifference. We are just machines for propagating DNA. It is every living object's sole reason for being. I'm going to go to the other quote by John Gray. The human mind serves evolutionary success, not truth. So if our mind, which is just a product of our brain, like the mind isn't an immaterial thing, it's just the mechanical working of our brain. So our thoughts aren't really truthful, they're not really rational, they're just there to serve evolution. So if you can undermine morality in this way, saying like, oh, it's just a byproduct of evolution, then truth is also undermined in the same way. That truth doesn't even matter. It's just how does it basically help the gene continue on. Again, I expressed a problem with this last week. They sort of give this volition to DNA. Like, why is it important for the DNA to keep surviving? Like what? Like the evolutionary process sort of then becomes the will. It's like you can imagine that if I was like sort of the first male monkey of my species, I might want all the female monkeys. So I'm just going to kill all the males. I don't care if I keep on living. I don't care if I'm the last male. So every male born I might kill. And so then what is it? And they would say like, oh, well, then that doesn't help evolution. But what does evolution care? You know? You can just ask. I'll repeat it.
Ben.
Dad.
Ben, as you have researched all of these philosophers and do any of them ever? Does it seem like they even search the scriptures, or do they just put aside the Word of God? I mean,
no.
I was going to say it seems like the depth in which they are investigating. There's so much clarity right in the Word of God, and yet it seems like it's almost put aside and not even thought about.
I mean, that gets to more, when we get more to specific arguments about Christianity. I mean, Sam Harris, who I talked about, he wrote 2 books on Christianity. And I mean, he quotes scripture in his books, you know, so he's researched it. So yeah, I mean, these are more bigger questions. And as I said in the beginning, I mean, I started with the very big question, and we're sort of getting smaller and smaller. And that's why I want to start to bring in more different religions. So right now we're just talking about God versus not God. But I'm going to get into like why Christianity over Hinduism, why Christianity over Islam, why Christianity over Buddhism. You know, bigger questions than to get smaller.
I just think it's funny that if the propagation of the DNA is so important, then it's important for that DNA in every living thing, not just human beings. And if that's the case, then it's very important for viruses to pass on their DNA as well.
Yep.
But the viruses actually end up killing us, and so that's bad for them. So in propagating their DNA, they're actually hurting the propagation of their DNA. So it seems like it's very stupid.
Yeah, actually, that was a point I forgot to make. Under even humanism, what makes humans so special? I mean, you could say that violates that's speciesism. You know, why should we be the ones to dominate over other species? You could say, think of the what was the big tragedy that happened? The tsunami. Remember the tsunami that happened? 100,000 people died. How awful was that? Well, it was great for the sharks. You know.
That is really.
And just a reminder, we're still going to be dealing in morality, but this argument is just going to give us a basis for our future discussions.